Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. And before the break, we were talking a little bit about this transition from Asia to the Middle East, and in particular, in this case, a little bit north to Iran. And there was a video making the rounds over the weekend, being propagated, of course, by the Islamic supremacist regime in Tehran's minions, let's call them. Soleimani, Qasem Soleimani, holding his grandson and cooing and cuddling him. And so one commenter on this was noting, Iran carefully shaped his image in life and continues to do so in depth. And all I could think to myself, looking at these images, and it's revolting to see them try to portray this man as some kind of humanitarian. Remember, Soleimani had the blood of hundreds of Americans on his hand, dead Americans, from roadside bombs that he was responsible for perfecting. Thousands of other Americans injured, maimed. Not to mention thousands of other civilians around the world, hundreds of thousands of people in Syria, all of the Europeans who have had to deal with the Syrian refugee crises themselves. This man has done incalculable damage as a human being, as the leader, the orchestrator of Iran's imperialist ambitions, growing them around the world. They put out this picture. And all I can think to myself is, this man is a monster. And you should read the comments, because the comments, in this case, read the comments, because though other people have hit the nail on the head with respect to this sort of jihadist propaganda coming out of Iran. And the sickening thing, really, when you think about it, is how much different is this image being portrayed, him holding his grandson? Well, first of all, again, how many people will never be able to hold their child or their grandchild because of what this man did in his life, this monster did in his life? That's my real takeaway. This man has destroyed an incalculable number of families and nations, for that matter. But also, this is sort of the way that our media portrayed him as well. Yeah, not an austere religious scholar per se, but whatever's analogous to that when it comes to being the architect, the mastermind of Iran's imperialist global ambitions, exporting its Islamist revolution around the world. There was other news out of Iran as well, though, that was overshadowed by some of these other headlines, but is hugely significant. Here's a headline from the Daily Mail. Exclusive secret document that proves Iran was building a nuclear weapon as far back as 2002, even while they claimed the technology was only for peaceful purposes. The document was seized as part of a raid by Israeli intelligence agents on a compound in Tehran in 2018 from an Iranian official. This document requesting the parameters of a warhead fitted on a missile in November 2002. Scribbled in the top left corner is a note from its nuclear chief who signs off on the plans. And this document is apparently the centerpiece of an as-yet unreleased report highlighting Iran's clandestine nuclear activities. Once again, how could you have a deal with a regime that's lied about and concealed and obfuscated and deceived on every aspect of its nuclear effort going back a couple of decades? It's the same guys in power, and it is the supreme leader, Khamenei, running the whole regime. Yeah, when the Obama administration tried to create this moderates hardliners split within leadership, what they failed to address is the fact that the elected leaders, quote unquote, are only eligible to achieve those positions if the malocracy controlled by Khamenei and others around him approve of them. It's a rubber stamped regime. It's a puppet regime at the end of the day. Puppet regime. So how can you have a deal with them? What is the deal? The deal isn't worth the paper that it's printed on. The deal is Iran continues to advance its program more clandestinely with hundreds of billions of dollars more, and then gets it legitimated at the end because of the sunset provisions that allow Iran to be treated as a legitimate nuclear power, to continue its ballistic missile proliferation. And meanwhile, our media, of course, headline from The Atlantic. This is pretty good, and this is in context of the unraveling of the so-called Iran nuclear deal, as even our European partners start to suddenly realize, hey, maybe this isn't a regime that would actually honor the garbage JCPOA. And this is a tweet from Mike Duran. And that the headline is from The Atlantic, which grudgingly admits that the killing of Soleimani was a masterstroke, but it can't bring itself to give Trump credit for knowing what he was doing. So here's the headline. Donald Trump stumbles into a foreign policy triumph. That, when you have to resort to that, you know he must have done something right. And the article is actually, I think, pretty revealing. This is from a European correspondent for The Atlantic. And he writes, while it's clearly too early to judge the long-term ramifications of the president's decision to order the killing, the initial assessment among many in the foreign policy establishment here in London is not quite what you might expect. The attack, in the view of analysts and British officials I spoke with, the latter of whom requested anonymity to discuss government discussions, has at a stroke reasserted American military dominance and revealed the constraints of Iranian power. Although Trump's foreign policy strategy, if one even accepts that there is such a thing, of course they have to be snarky like this and question the legitimacy of everything, has many limits. His unpredictability and, most crucially, his willingness to escalate a crisis, okay, that's one way to portray it. Another way is diffuse a crisis by using overwhelming force such that Iran will think twice about doing anything hostile to the U.S. Willingness to escalate a crisis using the U.S. military and economic strength have turned the tables on Iran in a way few thought possible. What is more, the strike has exposed the gaping irrelevance of Europe's leading powers, Britain, France, and Germany, in this whole crisis. The E3, which were the main parties to the deal along with the United States and Iran, which have long sought to keep the Iranian nuclear deal alive by undermining the U.S. policy of maximum pressure on Iran, have so far failed to do so. This week, they were finally forced to admit the apparently terminal collapse of the Obama-era nuclear deal, releasing a joint statement to announce that they were triggering its dispute resolution clause because of Tehran's failure to abide by the terms of the agreement. The reality of the situation is startling. Europe's attempts to keep the deal alive have achieved little in Tehran because of the continent's powerlessness, and European opposition to Trump's Iran policy has achieved even less in Washington. In an interview, Boris Johnson all but admitted defeat in keeping the nuclear deal alive, calling instead for a new Trump deal. In other words, Trump exposed reality. There was no deal to be had. And as I've written in a couple articles recently at the Federalist, and I'll share them, they were cheating on the deal the whole time. We have documentary evidence of it, but beyond that, we couldn't even have visibility into any of the military sites where likely the nuclear weapon work took place. So, okay, they could argue that they maybe complied with some of the terms of a deal, but we only saw the places that they wanted us to see. Iran wouldn't let internationally recognized inspectors certified under the deal to verify and do actual checks at the sites where their malign activities actually took place, likely take place. So my friend Omri Sarin, who's the National Security Advisor for Senator Ted Cruz, and a must-read on all things Iran, tweets out, news out of Iran, the regime is threatening to decrease cooperation on nuclear issues if the Europeans pressure them over their, checks notes, confirms, yep, if the Europeans pressure them over their lack of cooperation on nuclear issues. And that was in response to an article, Iran may review cooperation with IAEA, that's the inspector body, if EU pressure mounts. So they didn't abide by the deal. They wouldn't let us check if they were abiding by the deal. And now, if we pressure them over lack of cooperation, they might really get angry. There's no deal to be had with Iran at the end of the day. The only deal ultimately is either this monocratic regime stays in power and advances towards nuclear weaponry, and ultimately we're probably forced to engage in a military response, massive military response. Or, and the Trump policies, whether by design or as part of a way to get towards forcing a surrender of this regime, has destabilized this regime to an unprecedented degree. And while a destabilized regime may lash out, at the same time, Iran has been exposed to have major problems. And the incompetence was on full display Tragic incompetence was on full display when they shot down a passenger plane and killed dozens of their own people, as well as people from all over the world, from Canada, elsewhere. It's a big deal that even for the European countries, Iran has reached too many of the steps in the deal, too many of the constraints, the strictures in the deal at this point, that even they can't stand by idly anymore. And by the way, this dispute resolution mechanism that was discussed in that Atlantic article I mentioned, ultimately it could get towards the UN reimposing sanctions on Iran, crippling sanctions, which in a country that is already, they lost Soleimani, they're overstretched abroad, dealing with protesters in all of the different countries that they count as their proxies. Chaos in Iraq, streets of Lebanon, on their own streets, having to resort to murdering, persecuting thousands of their own people right now. Their coffers going dry, shut out of the international oil markets, main source of revenue. They could be on the ropes. And worth pointing out one more thing while we're sticking on the Iran topic. This was a good piece, a good reminder. Urge you to check out this article on Powerline, Bernie's history with Iran. Like I said, the left, historically, in our last episode, always stands with these horrible totalitarian regimes. This is in the Daily Beast. On April 1, 1979, this is Powerline quoting that article. April 1, 1979, the Theocratic Islamic Republic of Iran was proclaimed. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who had returned to Iran from exile to assume command of the revolt, became supreme leader in December of that year. His rise was accelerated by the seizure on November 4 of 52 American diplomats and citizens of other countries at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Then we have the hostage crisis. Virtually all Americans, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents united in support of the hostages and the international call for their freedom. One prominent political figure on the 2020 stage, then almost completely unknown, stood apart by joining a Marxist-Leninist party that not only pledged support for the Iranian theocracy, but also justified the hostage-taking by insisting the hostages were all likely CIA agents. Who was that person? It was Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, member of a Trotskyite party, stood with the Iranian malocracy. By the way, he's not alone in that romance of those sort of regimes. None other than Elizabeth Warren, and this was revealed previously, but brought up again recently in an article at Front Page, called on the Obama administration to clear Ethel Rosenberg's record. Who is Ethel Rosenberg? Well, you'll recall she was tried for treason, essential in helping the Soviet Union develop nuclear capabilities. The atom bomb, rather. As the article states, she could be the next commander-in-chief. Called on the Obama administration to formally exonerate Soviet atomic spy Ethel Rosenberg. Sent a letter dated January 10, 2017 on behalf of one of her sons. Constituent request that you provide a thorough review of their request that you issue a proclamation exonerating his mother, Ethel Rosenberg, executed by the U.S. for conspiracy to commit espionage in 1953, effectively a treasonous act. She wasn't alone, by the way, in the Democratic Party. But that goes to show you the nature of who we're dealing with on the other side right now. Once again, this is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on the Buck Sexton Show. Back just after this. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton, and let's transition. We just talked about a little bit the Middle East, Iran's malevolence, the left's embrace of those totalitarian regimes, be it Iran or elsewhere around the globe. And there's another similarity in terms of their ideology. And I'll get there by way first of talking about the fact that this week, President Trump is scheduled to be at Davos. What is the main topic at Davos this year? Naturally, climate change. The head of the World Economic Forum, its founder, Klaus Schwab, said, "We do not want to reach the tipping point of irreversibility on climate change. We do not want the next generations to inherit a world which becomes ever more hostile and ever less habitable. Just think of the wildfires in Australia, and we'll get to that in a second. An annual risk survey published by his organization put climate and other environmental threats ahead of risks posed by geopolitical tensions and cyber attacks. The first time the survey found the top 5 long-term risks were all environmental. Talk about groupthink. From extreme weather events to businesses and governments failing to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Part of this is sustainability, the theme at this year's Davos meeting. To grapple with global warming becoming worse because of growing divisions among nations and businesses on how to tackle it. The meetings, which will see over 50 heads of state and government, including German Chancellor Angela Merkel and Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte, descend on the Alpine resort, seeking to give concrete meaning to stakeholder capitalism, a concept that businesses should serve the interests of all society rather than simply their shareholders. Remember, I talked about woke crony capitalism last week when it came to BlackRock. That's the agenda on the table for all of the leaders, business heads, the politicians around the world meeting at Davos. And I cannot wait for Trump to smash them into smithereens during this meeting over this. 53 heads of state at Davos, 1,700 business leaders, including CEOs from 8 of the 10 most valuable companies in the world. 88% of the cars used by the World Economic Forum are electric or hybrid. Climate is the excuse for the totalitarian anti-capitalist system that they're all like-minded. All the globalist leaders there are like-minded on this. Why do they care about the environmental stuff? Because it means power and control. It's a way to use science to justify control over your life. And they will profit, of course, from it because they're the ones in charge of all of these green initiatives, invested in the green companies. It's a wealth redistribution scheme to them. In the process, it impoverishes all of us. So I was happy to see on this topic that Bernie Sanders and as well AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, came out and panned the USMCA that the Trump administration just was able to push through in the Senate. Here's Bernie. Not a single damn mention of climate change in his tweet. Seems like a happy guy. And Sanders suggested on the campaign trail that fossil fuel executives are probably criminally liable for climate change. He's expressed interest in potentially prosecuting them. That's totalitarianism. That's if you have wrongthink, you should be shut up, stifled. So I urge you to read this article from Rupert Darwall in The Hill, and I've interviewed him separately as well. Look it up on YouTube, and I can share it as well. Climate religion is fueling Australia's wildfires, getting back to that. And what he shows is that the wildfires in Australia that have been hugely destructive to their environment are largely the consequence of environmentalist policies. It's not because of climate change, quote unquote. It's because they haven't been able to control the brush that has led to these massive wildfires. They're not allowing people to burn the brush, which would prevent there from being these massive conflagrations. So environmentalism has real consequences. It is irrational, is what Darwall argues in this article. It is a religion, but it's a religion that the true believers truly believe in science as infallible and that the science is settled on this issue, which is not. But it's also a religion that totalitarians use for control over all of us. This is Ben Wungert in for Buck Sexton on The Buck Sexton Show. Back just after this. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton, and we were just talking about totalitarianism of one kind, which is the use of infallible science in furtherance of an anti-capitalist agenda that ultimately is about power and control over you and for the people lording those policies over us and imposing them upon us, to our great detriment, impoverishing us while they benefit. We'll shift to a different kind of creeping sort of totalitarianism, which is an assault on our individual civil liberties under the guise of national security, while the bad guys actually get off scot-free, and there's no justice. And that concerns the recent Inspector General report on FISA abuses, which comes, of course, in the broader sort of mosaic around Spygate and what we've been dealing with, laboring under for the last 3+ years, and I fear we're going to continue dealing with for many more years to come, unfortunately. So we're going to talk with senior contributor to The Federalist, a colleague of mine, Margot Cleveland, who spent nearly 25 years as a permanent law clerk for a federal appellate judge on the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals. and is a former full-time faculty member and current adjunct instructor for the College of Business at the University of Notre Dame. Margot, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Ben.
So let's start by level setting a little bit. The IG report on FISA abuse with respect to Carter Page cites 17 significant inaccuracies and omissions in the Bureau's applications for warrants to surveil Carter Page under FISA, starting, I believe, back in 2016. What is the most underreported element of the IG report that you've discovered thus far in parsing it in great depth?
So I would say there's actually a tie for two. One is that the IG completely missed that the DOJ, FBI had told the FISA court that Steele has this network of sources because he used to work as a spy for the British government. And the reason that is such a huge revelation is the FISA court didn't really do much here. They did pretty much a rubber stamp, except for on the first go-around. And on the first go-around, they presented they present a copy to get some feedback. So they presented what they call a read copy to a liaison at the court. The read copy gives them a chance to go through and see if there are any issues. And one of the issues that was raised was, how does your source, Christopher Steele, have this network of sources that he was able to get this information from? And the response that was given is because he used to work, and it's redacted, but everyone knows what it is. He used to work for MI6. And the liaison, the lawyer working for the FISA court, told the government to change and put that detail in there. Elsewhere, though, in the IG report is a finding that Steele was not using those sources. None of the sources that he used for his dossier had the connection of being from his former work with the UK British intelligence. That's significant because the court cared about that. They asked about it, and all the government said was, oh, yeah, he has this network of sources because he used to be in intelligence for, our British colleagues. Think about that. As a judge, you're looking at it and saying, well, this subsource, this is going to be legit because British intelligence relies on the same people. But the truth is, no, they don't. They did not, Steele did not use the same sources. So I would say that is one underreported story that should be huge. I think that he should have called that out as an 18th mistake. I think that was significant, maybe even more so than other ones, because the FISA court specifically asked for it. And then I would say the second mistake, or second underreported comment here, was that in the IG report, there was this just little passage exchange where it said that Bruce Orr, who was one of the DOJ assistant deputy attorney generals, he was the one who was kind of feeding stuff from Steele to the FBI. It said that he had called a meeting, an interagency meeting. And the only reason we know about this is after the meeting, one of his colleagues asked Orr, why would we work with this Russian oligarch? And it was Olga, and I'm not even sure how to pronounce his name. Yes, thank you. So the colleague asked after the meeting, why would the U.S. work with him? And Orr said that the reason why was because there was corruption in the Trump campaign. The question was all the way to the president, and he said yes. So there's a couple of things here that no one's really picked up on. Was he or called this interagency meeting? So who was at this meeting? What other agencies were involved? And it seems to tie back to Orr's official role, which was in charge of this interagency group. But Orr said, oh, I didn't talk to my bosses about Christopher Steele because it had nothing to do with my real job. So that's one component of it. But two, it looks like Orr was trying to push cutting a deal with the oligarch in order to get Trump because he told his colleague that afterwards. The other part of it is the timing of this. This came after Orr had met with a couple, I think there were three other folks that were looking at the charges against Paul Manafort. And it had nothing to do with them, yet they were trying to figure out how to get this pushed. And Andrew Wiseman was one of the individuals. And one of the things that the IG report said is they were trying to come up with strategies of how to move that case along. So one of the questions I have was this reach out to these other agencies part of this strategy? So I have two separate pieces over at the Federalist. They're a couple, maybe a week or so old. There's been so much on the IG report that has gone unreported, but those two really should be blockbusters, and people should be focusing on this. And I hope that Barr and Durham are, because those are huge missing components to it.
How culpable is the FISA court itself? And I think you have identified them as being culpable in some of the abuses with respect to the case of Carter Page, which, of course, then invites the question of how many other cases has the FISA court effectively botched or not held to the proper standard that such important cases should be held to. How culpable is the court, and what would be the proper way for their culpability to be remedied, or for there to be justice for the FISA court individuals, personnel involved with this themselves?
Right. So on the latter point is judges make mistakes. Lawyers who work for judges make mistakes. So there really is no culpability other than that it's a black eye on them, and it should be. But it's unfortunate because it doesn't seem as if they're recognizing that. They're pointing all the fingers at the DOJ and the FBI, and their fingers should be pointed there. The FISA court trusted the lawyers, and they should have been able to trust the lawyers. But at the same time, someone should have caught that there was no established reliability for these subsources, that Steele was the only one who supposedly had reliability. And that's where it's the DOJ and FBI's fault for misrepresenting that. But he cannot build up the subsources and the subsources. And yet the FISA court allowed what the subsources said happened to be the basis for probable cause. Even though the FISA warrant or FISA applications were clear that neither Steele nor his primary subsource had the direct knowledge of this. And that actually ties back to the point I just made about they likely thought that these subsources were ones that fed the British intelligence information and intelligence. And because of that, assumed that they were reliable and didn't go that next step and say, where in the application does it see that? So there is culpability. I don't think it's nearly as great as the DOJ's and the FBI's because they made so many mistakes, but they should learn from this and hopefully look at things more closely. The other part of it that I found in reading the IG report and some of the kind of the text messages that were going back and forth between the parties is it looks like it was a little bit too cozy. They were concerned about how one of the individuals involved in the process would kind of lead the talk to the liaison. So apparently someone from the group that handles the FISA applications talks with the liaison, and they were concerned. Peter Strzok was concerned with how is he going to set it up? Is he going to make it iffy, or is he going to make it sound like a done deal? Which to me indicates that there's a little bit too much reliance on the DOJ's presentation, and that they should be looking at it a little bit more objectively. So I think that, again, it's much more on the DOJ and FBI, but the FISA court definitely has some culpability for it.
Looking at the remedies that the FBI proposed when the FISC pointed the finger, as you said, back at them, and said, what will you do basically to ensure that the court isn't misled again in the future? My read of it as a layman, and your eyes can easily glaze over looking at the sort of language that's used to explain what the FBI is going to do down the road to reform themselves, is that they were basically toothless reforms. Is that a fair assessment?
Ben, I'll have to be frank. I have not looked at what they suggested doing. I'm still so buried in what they did in the past. And I also kind of look at it as you're always going to say the nice stuff. It's when the rubber meets the road that I really am going to care about it. And I think that there's the more significant change would be that the FISA court requires that you have an amicus, someone who is arguing on behalf of the person who's going to be tapped. So I really have no idea if it's going to be toothless or not. But there's so much that went wrong, and until we know everything that went wrong, it's hard to say how do you reform it.
One more point that I think is worth
Sure.
making is that before this FISA abuse report came out, there was another IG report that didn't get nearly as much focus by the media,
Yes.
which was on confidential human sources, i.e. informants,
Yes.
i.e. spies. How significant is that report in context of the FISA abuse report?
It was so key. And I guess now I'm going to have to say it's a three-way tie of what's the most underreported stories. So the IG report that came out, I want to say 2 weeks before the Carter Page one, made clear that the FBI was not putting derogatory information in the confidential human source files because it was harming the prosecutors, the U.S. attorneys' ability to use them because they would have to turn it over in discovery to the defendants, and then it would make them not seem as credible. That should be huge. We're not talking about one guy who accidentally made a mistake or one guy who purposely deleted or changed an email. The IG report made it clear that this was a fairly prevalent approach, a very prevalent opinion, that the FBI recognized that they don't want certain things put in these files, which means how in the world can the FBI say that this individual is credible, that there is nothing derogatory when they don't put it in the file? And to me, you read those two things in conjunction, it makes the second report even more damning. But everyone was so focused on what the Page report was going to say and looking forward to that, they missed what the IG admitted the FBI was doing. So there's so much that has gone unreported, and part of it's just amusing to me that for 2 years, every little thing that happened that maybe looked like Russia collusion was blown up and just read into so much and reported. The IG report's been out for, 2-3 weeks, and it's old news, and there's so much buried in it.
Yeah, and you've done just an exceptional job reporting on it. I urge all of our listeners and viewers to check out Margot's work at The Federalist. We're going to have to leave it right there, but Margot, thanks so much for coming on the program today.
Thanks so much, Ben. It was nice to talk with you.
And this is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on The Buck Sexton Show. Back with some closing thoughts just after this. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. And during the break, I was just thinking about what is sort of the unifying theme that ties today together. And that is really one of liberty versus tyranny. The tyranny of an all-powerful government that uses science as an excuse to stifle our rights and profit personally from it, whether it's our adversaries, be they the Chinese Communist Party or the Iranian malocracy and their malign imperialist expansionist efforts, or whether it be our leftists at home, not only in the realm of under climate change turning us into an anti-capitalist bastion, but as well seeking to divide us as a means of conquering us through poisonous identity politics. And again, what Martin Luther King Jr. argued for was the antithesis of that. It was about freedom, individual liberty, respecting the dignity of the smallest minority, the individual, consistent with what our founders advocated for in those founding documents. And one of these enemies of what unifying Americanism, which is the strongest bulwark against all of this, is Ilhan Omar. And I teased this last week, and I'll reveal the title of my book now, forthcoming next month, is American Ingrate. Ilhan Omar and the progressive Islamist takeover of the Democratic Party. And I'll be talking more about the book in the coming days, but subscribe to my newsletter. I'll give you a heads up when it's available. It's bit.ly/BHW News. Urge you to subscribe there, and you'll be abreast when the book comes out. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen or watch us over the last few days, as I've had the privilege to fill in for Buck. I want to thank Buck for giving me the opportunity to fill his big shoes. This has been Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on the Buck Sexton Show. Give me a follow at BH Weingarten. Look forward to talking next time. Thanks so much.